All right, thank you so much. Thanks for that great intro, too. Before we dive in, quick show of hands here. I'm kind of curious. I know we're mostly Vue developers here. I mean, we came to this conference for a reason, but who's been using, third-party data in their Vue apps already? Some API calls, some async data, I think. Good chunk for, people at home, about half at least. So this will be a very interesting talk then. First and foremost, who am I? So I'm Rijk van Zanten. I'm a Dutch-born and raised, designer developer. I live in Brooklyn, New York right now. I got my start as a user experience designer actually while in college, but I got into front-end development not too long after. So in the decade or so since, I've worked, on many data-driven apps and websites for, ranging from local schools to like big Fortune 500 companies. And while doing that, I started working on a CMS, content management system, to help me build all those projects, right? I've since joined forces with Ben Haynes, our now CEO, to create what turned into a composable CMS called Directus. What now? So Directus is a composable CMS is what we're calling it, meaning that you can use it for basically any sort of data-driven use case, right? So think about content management, customer relations management, product inventory management, all that kind of stuff. For developers, kind of think of it as the best of a CMS meets the best of a backend as a service, right, in one thing. So you get, a REST GraphQL WebSockets API to interact with the data through APIs, and then the Data Studio that is actually built in Vue, so it's very nice to be amongst you, to help technical and your non-technical users to manage that content. Right? While we were building Directus, as you might imagine, we learned tons of stuff, especially around data loading, because it turns out, building a CMS is kind of difficult. It's actually kind of very difficult. There's so many different edge cases, there's so many types of users, so every single decision that you make about how that app works and how you interact with the data, you got to really, really think it through, right? Hours and hours of sessions doing on this. So in the last couple of years while building all this, a couple of patterns have emerged around data loading, state, and user experience, and sort of the overlap between that. So I figured it could make for a pretty great topic for a little chat here. Before we dive into that nitty-gritty, though, what is data, right? Loads of people think loads of different things about what data even is or what it means. It's one of those words in tech that can just mean anything to different people, like multi-tenancy, whatever that means. Like the dictionary lists as facts, figures, statistics, details, particulars, specifics, features, evidence. I'm already boring myself, but basically it's just everything, right? Everything can be data, but that being said, for the sake of this talk, and really for my own sanity as well, when I say data, I'm really explicitly referring to information you are communicating to your end user, right? So the user of your app. So exploring the state of data loading. I mean, I feel like half the talks have the state of something in it, because it's such an easy pun to make, right? State, few. So for this little talk, I've identified the 5 most common patterns and strategies that we've seen emerge while building Directus, of getting data into our Vue app and then displaying it to the end user for us to dissect and explore. So the goal is really to identify them, understand what they are, contextualize when and how you use them, to make you help those intentional decisions when you're building your own app. Most of these you might already know, you might already use. Hopefully you use all of them, but in any case. So to help us visualize a little bit what we're doing here, right, let's pretend we're just building a tiny little social media app. So really your run-of-the-mill short-form text platform, so you can log in, follow a couple accounts, post a couple of tweets, whatever. You can be followed, you can follow other people, you can post messages, all that kind of stuff, but let's just call it why. So I'll walk through just building this little fake app as a way to demonstrate some of these different strategies, right? Starting with the very first one, on application load. Kind of like including, the static data into your app during the build time or pre-rendering it server-side, depending on how you're running the app. That very often includes like static assets or images, videos, that kind of stuff, maybe translation strings, and any other text that you have hard-coded in your components, right? Maybe your button says click, and it'll click. So static websites, obviously a very, very obvious example of that strategy is by definition everything has to be included in the build. To do that, a lot of static data handling is just handled by using a bundler. So I'm assuming that most of you, again, maybe show of hands, most of you using Vite or another bundler? Basically everybody. I mean, how else would you build a Vue app, really? So by doing so, you're already, automatically inlining a lot of that static content, right? Which is great for your end user, because it means that once the bundle has downloaded, they don't have to load anything else ever again. So it will pretty greatly improve that perceived performance for the end user, as it feels like they don't have to load anything else ever again. But it is very, very easy to overdo it, right? And then really hurt the performance of your app. I'm sure many of you have experienced this by including, big libraries or whatnot, that suddenly you have megabytes and megabytes of bundle. But the same goes for data too. Like take translations again, for example. If you translate your app, and let's say 12 different languages or so, right? If you bundle all of those into your bundle, before you know it, you're shipping all of those translation strings for all of those 12 languages to every single user that opens your app. Not good. Really hurting the performance in the process. So, you can combat that by asynchronously importing things you don't need for every view, and just really making sure you're not including any stuff that you don't want to be in there by checking, a bundle analyzer plugin every now and again. So the one here on the screen is the rollup bundle analyzer. Pretty sure it works really well with Vite as well, because that's the one I've been using. So make sure to check that every now and again. So in our little imaginary app, beautiful design. I call it simple, right? It's clean, modern. We're going to be pre-bundling and inlining that little logo SVG, and we'll load the translations for the particular user based on the browser's length locale. So the components that are used within the private view, so that you see after your login, those are not included in the bundle by default. We're using one of those async imports, right? So for people that don't log in and they just want to look at the public pages, they don't need any of that stuff, keeping the bundle nice and small. But what happens then when the user logs in, right? Strategy number 2, on login. So if your app is showing any sort of personalized content, or the user may need access control to see certain things, obviously you cannot include it just for everybody to see, right? So the moment you log in, there is a touch point in that life cycle to fetch more information. That information oftentimes includes, the user itself. Maybe you want to show a little avatar and their name or something, and data that can be used on every view in your app, but is still unique for the user, right? I think the navigation elements on the YouTube website are actually a pretty good example of that. So as you can see, the subscriptions listed in the left, they're going to be visible on every single view in this web page, or this web app really, and they're being loaded on login. In the view environment, this is a real tiny example. The way I would solve that is using PNF for the global stores. This is global data within my app. And that store is really responsible for keeping track of what that user state is, right? Which is my current user, and then also has a logging action that does that. Obviously, being from Directors myself, I'm using the Directors SDK to log in, but you can imagine you just put your fetch request right there for any other service, really. Then also that same login will call any other stores that require that user information to exist. So in this example, I'm using a subscription store, so we can show something on the left-hand side, right? That method of data fetching here is pretty ideal for loading that global application state that is dependent on the user, but once more, don't overdo it, right? It is easy to accidentally just download the whole app on login and just download every view and all the content for it, vastly increasing the memory usage of the app and just slowing down that login moment. And do you really need that much information when somebody logs in, right? Even in my tiny little example here, I'm just reading the whole current user. Do I need that? Do I just need their name? Do I just need their avatar? Stuff to think about, right? In our little fake social media app, I'm going to be using that. Once you load in, we're going to be loading the sidebar content, because it's going to be the same for every page. And then I'll preload the content for that home page, because I kind of don't like skeleton UI that much. All right, so this is, we can log in. We have some data showing up on the page, but it's not a proper Twitter or whatever clone without a detail page, right? So you can click on one of the individual tweets or X's, I guess, I don't know, to see that as a single page and then share a link and that kind of stuff. So to do that, we'll use the navigation guard. So some of you might have tried this out in Vue Router before. Navigation guards, you can use that to block access or redirect traffic and that kind of stuff. But you could use it to fetch data as well before you render the actual page, right? So when you do that, it results in an experience that is kind of traditionally website-like, in a way where you click a link, nothing happens for a bit, and you have a website page, right? A lot of backend framework and tooling work like that by default. You click a link on the front end, you redirect in the browser, GET request, backend does its thing, new HTML page shows up. In Vue, it's a little bit less common, because everything is normally done on the client side, the routing. But you can achieve it in the Vue router by using that before enter hook in your route definition to asynchronously fetch the data, and then using the meta object to then pass it through into the props of the actual component. When done well, that approach can result in a kind of a less jarring experience for the end user. Because keep in mind, if you don't do this, then your page will effectively render immediately, and then you have to asynchronously download all of the stuff on the page, and then start filling in the blanks basically as soon as the data is loaded, right? That can be pretty flashy, especially if you have a fast backend, like directives, where you open the page, it renders the new page immediately, you render a loading state immediately, and then within 100 milliseconds or so, you render the content, right? So it's kind of like a flash of unstyled text. In regular websites, it just goes back to back to back to back. It's a bit of a jarring experience. That being said, though, again, a couple of downsides in this project, in this approach, because by default, there's really no indication to the end user that anything is happening, right? You click a button, nothing happens, your app is busy, stuff shows up. So you will have to account for some sort of global loading state when the user clicks a link that is fetching data before you show the page. For regular website page transitions, the browser has a loading state. You click a link, you see the browser, the refresh icon turns into an X, and you have a little spinner and all that kind of stuff. That doesn't exist for us front-end developers, the JavaScript routing devs yet, although it might be coming soon in the new navigation API, which is exciting. In the meantime, you do need to have some sort of global loading state that you add yourself. Another downside of this is the developer experience can be a little bit rough sometimes, because now you're sort of handling that data flow in two different places, right? You have the stuff within the component itself, within the component that runs the route, but also within the router now. You also have to account for the difference between route enter and route update, right? What happens if somebody goes to a new page fresh versus what happens if somebody just changes the parameter where you link from one tweet to a different tweet. In our fake app, we'll use that navigation guard technique to fetch the main content for the page, but to keep it fast, we're explicitly not loading the responses right away, because what the user is interested in seeing is that main box, right? That's the page that you're coming for. Everything else can be fetched with the next strategy, which is basically fetching it just in time or asynchronously. I think this is probably the most common one. I'm going to assume that most people that raised their hands when they were using third-party APIs, this is basically what you do by default, right? In your component, you're fetching that data asynchronously with a regular fetch, putting it in a ref, showing it on the page. That pattern is used all over the place. You can use it for, page content, metadata, comment sections, all that kind of stuff. You see it a lot, though, for on-page filtering, right, where you have a list of stuff, and you have a couple of buttons to filter down the list. Click a button, list filters. It's all inline async data fetching. So if you take another look at YouTube, we have the search bar up top there. If you check those filters out, you see, there's a small loading state for those items on the page, and then it just refreshes it inline, right? Very common pattern. Fun little detail, though. If you see the search bar up there, that is actually not part of the filter. If you notice that, if we're changing that, it will actually do one of those navigation guards. You saw the little progress bar at the top? I'm pretty sure it's most likely because they're syncing that search state with the URL, right? So by putting it in the URL, they're triggering a new route transition using a navigation guard pattern rather than the on-page. Because those filter boxes, those are not in the URL at all, right? So if I hard refresh, that state's just gone. In Vueland, again, I'm going to assume that many of you have tried this before. You simply request something, put it in a ref, use it from there. That being said, one of the pitfalls that I made many times, to be honest, is like forgetting how to deal with errors and loading states, right? So I made a couple of composables myself before where you just keep sort of like a loading ref and a date ref or data ref and then an error ref that might be null, might be not. Long story short, I'd recommend using the use async state composable from the Vue use library. Big shout out. Just makes it way easier. You don't really have to think about it anymore. You just get the state from the request, you get the ready state, the loading state, any errors that might show up, and a new execute function to refresh it dynamically. Nice and easy. This approach is great for asynchronously showing more content on the page. Additional content only, though. Main page content, really flashy. So in GitHub, for example, many of you probably have seen this. If you open, for example, that projects view, you see a little spinner. It takes a second to load the additional metadata for that little drop-down section. And then once it's done, it shows it on the page, right? However, if you really rely on this for a bunch of stuff on your page, you can easily end up with something like that, right? You just end up presenting the end user with tons of loaders and spinners and that kind of stuff while you're waiting for the individual bits of your page to show up. Nobody really wants that tube of tears, right? Also, if you haven't seen any of the web brief stuff yet, I highly recommend Googling it in the break, not now. In our little Y app, once more, we'll use that asynchronous strategy to dynamically load the responses and quote tweets, so sort of like the rest of the page, not the main tweet, in this fashion. In this particular case, I will use a skeleton loader because I don't want sort of a completely empty page to be there for the user, and then all of a sudden there's like stuff that shows up, right? And a skeleton loader could be nice for this additional use where it sort of fades in the place where you know it's gonna be when the post has been fully loaded. All right, so in a social media app, posts can get quite a bit of traction over time. They're getting more likes, they're getting more reposts, they get new replies, all that kind of stuff. So how do we deal with that? Using the last of those strategies, real time. It feels like it's a little bit less commonly used than the other ones, but it's also seemingly getting a little bit more popular. Always fun. So with real time, I explicitly mean that the server is sending more stuff to the client automatically without the client explicitly asking for it. You see it used a lot in multiplayer apps. Think Figma, the cursors, that kind of stuff. But you're seeing it more and more in the wild now for less obvious things as well. So in that same GitHub example, if another user is on the same page changing something, like adding a label, like I'm doing on the right, you'll see it sort of live update on the left, right? So that is a pretty clever use for just small scope, real time, if you want to call it that. Call it that. But it's a really, really nice user experience nonetheless. It is definitely a little bit less easier to implement than the other strategies, though, I'll give you that. It so heavily relies on the backend you're using, any sort of real-time service providers you might be using. It's also pretty heavily dependent on what you're trying to do, right? So in this label case, is it like a one-time ping to update it, or is it just like a continuous stream of data, etc.? In Directive specifically, we do have a subscribe method that you can use for that. But again, bear in mind, this is one of the examples that, it really depends on what tool you're using for this interaction. In this little example here, we're creating a subscription on any of the replies to the current item. Therefore, whenever a new reply shows up, we're going to put it in that ref for the replies, and it will just auto-update on the page. Right? The updating content in real time here, real beneficial. Like we saw on GitHub, if you have multiple users on the same page, it's a great way to keep that in sync. But once more, be aware though, it's just like with the page data with the tons of spinners. Once you're updating sort of main chunks of content on a page, stuff might jump around quite a bit, right? Because you're effectively re-rendering that page based on the new data that comes in. So it can be very, very jarring for that end user. Just imagine you're trying to read a blog post or something, and in the middle of a sentence that you were trying to copy-paste to a friend, it just disappears, or just like the whole sentence changes. It can be really annoying. Another potential food gun is the lack of feedback and feed forward, right? If you're implementing a real-time type of approach where content is automatically saved, it might also not be obvious, right? If you're just typing away in a field, how do you know that it was saved or not? Actually, if time allows, quick anecdote. I actually made my support team real mad the other day when I realized that Cloudflare autosaves. So I changed, some setting in Cloudflare, and all of a sudden we had like an outage problem. And I was like, what the hell happened? I just clicked around the box. I didn't hit save or deploy or anything, right? But it autosaved. Today I learned. Be warned. Don't be me. So in Y, we'll use that real-time subscription to update, little metadata things like the follower count, the little favorite count or stars, whatever. We'll also be using it to dynamically add more replies on the page that are added after the fact. This pattern might work in this particular case because we know that the replies are chronological, right? So any new reply that's added, by definition, will go on the bottom of the page. So that's one of those things, right? I don't want to add them in the middle, because that might make them jump around, all that kind of stuff, but it'll just end up at the bottom of that stack. That being said, though, the user might not even notice that, right? If you're on a Mac where you have the nasty hiding scroll bars, if something adds on top of the page, you have no idea that it's even there. So in this example, do keep that in mind, that you might need to have some sort of badge or notice or something that more content has showed up, right? All right, cool. So with all of those 5 strategies applied, it feels like we have a fairly decent starting point for an X clone Y. Of course, there's a couple of more features to add, account pages, seeing other views of followers, adding media, all that kind of stuff. But all of that can really be added with one of them or a combination of those 5 strategies that we've seen, right? So outside of this sort of fake theoretical Y app, what could this look like in real life? Well, to use our own app as a quick example, so in Directus, when the app first loads, we're going to dynamically look at the browser language for the end user, and then download the translations just for that language, right? We're also going to be loading the custom theme that might exist. We're going to load any sort of public logos before we render that first page, right? So for the end user, it's going to be kind of like a website. There's a hot second for that to load. Page shows up. Then when the user logs in, we're going to be downloading the minimal stuff that we need to render out the main view of the app, right? So in our case, that is access control. That is what's the last page that you left off from, and what is sort of the preset for the page you're going to be on next. So therefore, we can now render the sort of private content for that app, right, that the user have access to. Excuse me. So that sidebar is a great example of that. That is just the data that this particular user has access to. Then once the user opens one of those items, we're going to use that navigation guard strategy to dynamically load the main content of the page. And then while we're on this page, only when the user interacts with them are we going to dynamically load revisions and comments, for example. So when we're opening the page, the user doesn't immediately see comments and revisions because they're not interacting with it yet. They don't need it yet, so we don't need to load it yet. And then while this is not quite released yet, it will be coming very soon, we can also use that real-time strategy to then dynamically show the user what other users are editing the same item. And if somebody else made a change, prompt them some sort of warning or message that says, hey, somebody else changed this as well. Do you want to overwrite yours? Do you want to merge them together? Cool. So now what, right? Which do you use? Well, as with most of these things in tech, it really depends. What a downer at the end of a talk every time. But it does really depend. What's the type of data? How long does it take to load? When do you need it? What do you really need? What is the experience you're trying to achieve? But if there's anything to take away from this little session, it really should be, 1, mix and match, right? Experiment. Try some of these different strategies. Try combining them as well. Because there is no one solution that works for everything. You got to use a little bit of everything. And sometimes using multiple at the same time, you get very interesting results. I think secondly, the perceived performance for your end user is almost always more important than the measured performance, right? So perceived performance, how does it feel for the user? Instead of what is the measured performance score, like something like Lighthouse. It's not always the best. Don't load things you don't need. Feels very obvious, worth repeating. Don't overload user with spinners. Sometimes you might even want to delay showing a loading state in the first place. Like if your load is quick enough, if your loading state is quickly enough, it might be perceived as instantaneous. And then sometimes loading more stuff up front to therefore making the app faster during the actual usage could be a good thing. A little bit controversial on websites where time to interactive is oftentimes the main metric to look at. But if you think about desktop apps, they might take a minute to start up, but then you have a very good experience after that, right? And then last but not least, do not build your own CMS. Take it from me, I tried it, we've been doing it for years. Certain things, just don't try this at home. If you like what you see so far and you want to nerd out a little bit more, we're right outside this door here with our booth. Happy to chat anytime. And make sure to check out our big new release too. We're doing our Leap Week next week with a bunch of new features and stuff, so make sure to check that out. QR code will take you right to the link. Thank you so much.